All right, guys, I'll get started. So good afternoon. This is Gabriela Mercuri from Scope Europe, and we are very happy to have you guys on the second episode of our webinar series on codes of conduct, building a trustworthy framework for international data transfers. So today our episode is being co-hosted by TrustArc, represented by Paul Breitbarth, and is counting also with the participation of Rebekka Weiß from Bitkom. So first of all, thank you very much to Paul and Rebekka for being here today. And also remembering that after the presentation, there will be an interactive Q&A session. So we really look forward to hearing your takes on it and your questions. So basically today we will be giving continuity to the discussions that we initiated in the kickoff webinar that took place in the end of February. So all of our webinars are going to be taking place on the last Wednesday of each month. And the kickoff webinar at the end of February, which gathered Google Cloud, Scope Europe, and KNL Gates, brought to the table a very interesting discussion on the legal challenges imposed by Schrems II on the existing instruments to address the issue. How did Schrems II impacted the cloud industry? And Natalie Ray from Google Cloud gave a quite really interesting insights on how cloud services providers are responding to this new landscape. And finally, we discussed on the role of codes of conduct, and more specifically of the EU Cloud CoC and the third country module on addressing these issues and its unique potential to guarantee the enforcement of European data protection standards while creating an appropriate environment for innovation and growth and for all size businesses to thrive. So for further details on the discussion, you can check the recording, which is available on our website, on our EU Cloud CoC website. And today our speakers will be taking the discussion a step further and discuss how to practically design and implement efficient compliance mechanisms for international data transfers. So in this context, there are two structural elements that we believe to be crucial in this discussion, which are the need to perform a comprehensive risk assessment, as well as the need to elaborate an efficient management system. So without further ado, I'm going to give the word to the speakers. So Rebekka, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Gabriela. And thank you for having me here today. I just quickly went over the participants list. It's great to see you all. It's one of the most pressing topics, I guess, there is in the data protection environment. So I'm happy to talk you through our Bitkom approach on the issue, and also happy to discuss everything in depth a bit later after also Paul's presentation. So just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Rebekka Weiß. I'm head of trust and security at Bitkom. Bitkom is the largest association for everything basically digital in Germany, and after the Schrems II ruling, the whole issue became one of the most pressing topics in our working group, data protection, which is, I guess, maybe even the largest group of experts in the data protection ecosystem there is. And after we talked about the Schrems ruling for a few weeks on a political level, we quickly realized we'd have to find a solution ourselves because we won't be seeing a political solution soon. There are talks about an enhanced privacy shield and so on, but it won't be here in the following weeks. So we basically went into solution finding to really give all industry stakeholders across all sectors, across all business levels, a tool with which to assess the risk of a data transfer and to devise what supplementary measures are basically necessary in the end, because that's what we really took out of the Schrems ruling. I think I'm not telling you anything new if I say that the ruling itself has caused a lot of perplexity within the whole industry across Europe, basically, or maybe even on a global scale, because the subtle consequences that you can really devise from what the CJEU has told us relate to international data transfers in general. So it's not only the privacy shield, it's also all the SCCs, it's the BCR consequences. And because of that, it's an issue that really concerns industry on a horizontal scope. So after all of those concerns have been raised on a lot of different panels and levels and stakeholder groups, we saw it necessary to put our thoughts into a concept paper. It is online there, or everything I'll just say now you can find there in more detail. I can send you, I'll put the link into the chat later. But I'll give you an overview of what we have been doing and what our approach to solve the issue basically is, because it really focuses on a risk-based approach. So to assess the individual data transfers and the risks that arise from it. So our concept is assessment based on each individual risk of each transfer that you do in your company, be it in the cloud environment or even beyond that. Because the concept explains the test of a data transfer and then describes the contents of every component you need to fulfill the requirement of those supplementary measures this CJEU has given us without really explaining it further. So it's based on 3 steps. What we think first is necessary, and this is independent on of the third country dimension of the data processing. So the first step is an examination of all the circumstances of the data transfer. So those individual circumstances and the assessments of those lead to certain, or may lead to certain risks and threats to a relevant, we call it protection goal of the GDPR. Because based on the reasoning that the CJEU has given us, those risks can be condensed into a few objectives that go through the whole GDPR. Those objectives might be, I don't know, transparency, for instance, confidentiality, integrity, and so on. I think you know those. And if you see those categories, then those allow you to devise a risk that arises from the data transfer or data processing that you're doing. And if the data processing also concerns the data transfer, then you get the link to the Schrems II situation. Yeah, that is basically the first step, just on a basic level. The second layer that you also need to assess, and I think that is one of the most crucial tasks the CJEU has given us in its ruling, is the examination of the level of data protection in the third country. Because we think that it is not reasonable to ask companies to do an assessment that fulfills the scope of the assessment the Commission is doing if they are doing an adequacy decision or preparing for an adequacy decision. Basically because, yeah, I think not many companies are even able to do that assessment. And even if they are, there is a risk if you really ask companies to do so, because a situation could arise where a company in Germany, I don't know, or in France, assesses the level of data protection in a different manner than in another member state. And that will really not lead to any harmonization in the matter, and would not lead us to more legal certainty. And that is what we definitely need right now. So we are trying to approach the assessment of this level of data protection in the third country with that in mind. So we can't really do what the Commission is doing, but we need to assess the basic structure of the level of data protection and everything that it concerns in a few countries. What we are doing right now, because our concept paper is not finished, it's in like the second draft stage right now. And we are obviously looking at a few certain countries in our assessment. The US is, of course, one of those. We will look into China. I think we will look into India as well, because those are countries that are absolutely necessary and widely used in the global data economy, and I think are therefore on the very high up on the list of concerns right now. So what we found, maybe just to give you an anecdote, because we have been talking about this for months now, what we always find a bit interesting is that we are assessing the level of data protection in third countries, and what we often find is that the level of data protection in the EU is not really that much better than in a few of those so-called third countries, which makes it a bit hard sometimes to find arguments to really needing supplementary measures, because if you look into access rights in a few member countries of the EU or in the EU as a whole, then it's basically not that much different from other regions of this world. But that's what the GDPR was, or has left us for this assessment. So this is the second step. The first step is examination of the circumstances of the individual data transfer. On the second layer, you assess as deeply as you can the level of data protection in the third country to really see whether there's an additional risk that is different from the level of data protection we have in the EU officially. And the third step, and I think that is one that has been discussed most in the last weeks, at least in our expert groups, are the supplementary measures, because the CJEU didn't really explain what kind of supplementary measures would be needed, or what would even be feasible. So quickly after the ruling, there was a lot of discussion about encryption, but it will not solve everything. So we are trying to really go into depth here and check whether the individual risks that arise from the step 1 and step 2 can be translated in something on a technical or organizational level, so you can protect the data at least better than it would be without the supplementary measure. So the measures that we are looking into are always linked to some of the specific circumstances of the transfer, because you have to link them back to the specific threats to the rights and freedoms of the data subjects coming out of the GDPR environment. And those risks also, and that derives from the second step, have to negatively contribute to the risks of the objectives of the GDPR I was referring to earlier. So you really connect on this third step, on the third layer, all the risks that arise from differing level of data protection in the third country and the individual circumstances that you assessed in the first step. So you really bring it all together in the third stage. As I said, I'm happy to share the concept paper so you can read through it if you're interested. We have been talking to data protection authorities a lot about this. They were quite open actually, because they are also a bit lost, I think, with all the CJEU has given us in this ruling. And from what we gathered and we heard from the data protection authorities, the concept might be a solution to the problem if we get to finalize it in time, and in time meaning before the guidelines of the EdPP are finalized, because I guess all of you have seen those and have been reading through them, because we have, and there are many additional obligations in there that don't really connect to what the CJEU has really told us. And we hope to amend, or at least give rise to new discussions on the EdPP guidelines here with our module. So we'll get something in there that allows our module to work in practice. Because as I said before, we won't be seeing a political solution anytime soon, unfortunately. And I really think we as an industry have to help ourselves. I think also codes of conduct will be a wise step to take in this regard. We have been in close contact, of course, with the colleagues of Scope Europe on this, because from what I gathered, we are approaching the issue with the same goal, a bit from different directions, but I think the steps are basically the same. So I'm happy to discuss in depth later. I'll leave it at that for now. I hope you got an overview of what we are doing, how we are approaching the problem. Happy to get your feedback on this, and I'll just give the floor to you, Paul.
Thank you, Rebekka. That was a great introduction, and I agree. We are all a bit lost at the moment, including the DPAs, and all trying to find the right solutions. And for me, and also for my colleagues at TrustArc, I think the one answer, if we are a bit lost, is to look at structure and see whether we can find a good structure to help other companies move forward in this very difficult situation. And that is also where privacy management systems come in. As you saw on the agenda for today's webinar, privacy management systems, we believe, can play a good role in finding a solution to the whole Schrems II conundrum that we are facing. It is not the single answer. It is part of a solution. Let me also be clear at that. I don't have a monopoly on wisdom, so there are always multiple answers for the challenges that we are facing. But I do believe that finding the right structure and finding a good management system to deal with all your data transfers will indeed be part of that solution. Because as the European Data Protection Board also writes in their recommendations, the very first step is to understand your data transfers. And we believe that a very good way to do that is also by going back to your Article 30 register, so your processing operations. What is the data that you have? For what purposes are you processing it? And also for which purposes are the data flowing to any non-EEA countries? By documenting that, you have already come a good way towards that data transfer risk assessment for which the third country module of the Cloud Code of Conduct will be a support. So why a privacy management system? Well, first of all, because you keep better and more structured documentation. If you use automation instead of spreadsheets or Word files or even emails, it will be easier for everybody in your organization to actually take that same approach to documenting what needs to be documented, and also then subsequently conducting the assessments that would be required. It is easier to keep it up to date because everybody is working in the same instance of your documentation instead of having multiple spreadsheets flying around where you never know if you are working in the latest version or if somebody has made a local copy that they're updating before syncing it back to the centralized version. And it's also easier to cross-reference and then also to share outcomes with third parties, and that comes to better reporting. And in the end, that is also what we need to do, because if we get that dreaded question from a supervisory authority, so tell us, how are you doing data transfers at the moment to non-EEA countries? then you need to be quick with your answer, and you don't have a lot of time to collect all the information. So if you have it available in a structured format, that already goes a long way. But then what should be included else, apart from, of course, your Article 30 information? How can you properly document that transfer risk assessment? Well, we have first versions available in our solutions at TrustArc, but there is no final answer here yet either, because we are still waiting for the final guidance of the European Data Protection Board. We are discussing it within the working group on the third country module here at Scope Europe. So also your input there is very much welcome. And also teams like Rebekka's at Bitkom, but also in other organizations are of course discussing, okay, how do we look at those data transfer risk assessments? What could be included there? And your input there is valuable as well. As mentioned, we don't know it all. Everybody is struggling and is a bit lost. So we are also looking for answers. But what I do know is that when you take your Article 30 register as your point of departure, it will actually be beneficial, because you can enrich that information from your register, like you would do, for example, when conducting a data protection impact assessment, or when doing the threshold assessment on the question whether you need to do a data protection impact assessment. I think you should look at your data transfer risk assessment in a similar way. Start drafting some questions. What do you need to know about the third country? What do we need to assess about the third country? Do we know their legislation already because it has been assessed in the past by the European Commission, meaning the country would be adequate, by the European Commission in the future, meaning a country may have lost their adequacy decision? That could happen next year. By the Court of Justice, like they have done for the United States. So for the United States, it will become more difficult already to find those supplementary measures. It's not excluded, but not as easy anymore. Or is this a new country that we are just starting to look at? Is this also something, and that is a question I explicitly put to you also for the discussion, is this something where a third country module could be beneficial if we are able to share at least the initial third country assessments, if we can share the evaluations of the legislation? That would still mean that you need to do the practical application for your specific data transfer for the business process that you are working on, but maybe some generic assessments could already be shared between a group like the EU Cloud Code of Conduct members. So that is something that I would be willing to explore. In any case, you can standardize the way that you look at that third country legislation. Indeed, looking at those surveillance laws. We know from the case law from the Court of Justice that the court has said, well, if you have surveillance laws in place, then it should dictate how the data can be collected, under what conditions the data can be collected, but also in what situations and how the data can be used and what safeguards need to be put in place. All of that needs to be part of the legislation and not just of a collection order or a subpoena. So you can already start with a questionnaire saying, okay, are these elements as identified by the courts? And, that is something that we could develop together. Are those elements all available in that third country legislation? And if somebody has assessed, say, the legislation in Ghana on those elements to stay away from the obvious countries, then that can be shared within the group. So that is then already part of the assessment that you don't have to redo. So there is no need for every organization to continuously reinvent the wheel. This is difficult enough, and this is also not immediately business confidential information. A legislative assessment is something that we could easily share. How it would apply to your specific business operation, that might be business sensitive, and that might be something where it is close hold and where you would not want to share it with a wider audience. And again, that is where I see the advantage of working with the third country module in the Cloud Code of Conduct, that we can help each other in conducting those basic and initial assessments. And it would also become possible, if you do use privacy management systems, to also link back to legal databases. Again, something we are doing at TrustArc. You may have heard we've recently launched something called Privacy Central, which allows you to assess your company's operations against legislation. And one of my wishes for the future development of such software is that we are also able to include surveillance legislation, so the third country laws that we are now all starting to look at. So that is also something that would then become possible. If you have automation in place, then you can also automate part of the legal analysis that comes with it and that is required. So a lot of standardization, a lot of reuse of information, better sharing, and then in the end also better reporting. So I would say that there is all the more reason to have this discussion on what a third country module on top of the Cloud Code of Conduct could bring, how we can do it in an effective way. I'm not ruling out that it will only be possible to do this for a limited number of countries or for a restrictive number of countries, that some countries may prove not to be possible. Only time will tell, and that will also depend on that final guidance of the European Data Protection Board that will, of course, continue to monitor and also continue to provide feedback if there are more occasions than we've had so far. So maybe to kick off the discussion, I'll leave it at that. Then there is still some time for us to also debate all these questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Rebekka. So we can now start our Q&A session. So you're all invited to pose your questions. If you wish to make a question, you can raise your hand and then we can unmute you. Just in the top right of your screen, you can raise your hand, or you can also write it through the chat, however you feel comfortable. But in the meanwhile, I will maybe start with a question that will go to Rebekka, actually. I wanted to know, how do you make sure that these risk categories, they remain future-proof, as well as how do you see this potential interaction between the guidelines and codes of conduct in this post-Schrems II landscape? How do you see that? Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. It's a very good question. Regarding future-proofing the whole concept and the risk categories, as we are concentrating on what the GDPR has given us, and the GDPR will be here for the near future. I think everything we're putting into our categories for our assessment will be future-proof because it's so embedded into the GDPR risk assessment framework. So I hope that will work because we are concentrating on the categories of data, basically. And if we assess the data protection level in a third country, we are looking into access rights and so on, and everything is already described in the GDPR. So I think the categories are broad enough to give enough clarity for the assessment, but are also broad enough to be future-proof. With regard to the connects between the guidelines and the future code of conduct, I would think that if the code of conduct is approved after we have the final guidelines in place, they would need to mirror what the EDPB is telling us, because as you have to get approval from the DPAs for any code of conduct, I guess they would also argue what the EDPB is going to argue in their final guidelines. At least that is my understanding. All the EDPB guidelines are not really binding per se, but I always found that they have a lot of impact. At the latest at the CJEU level. So I think every DPA would really consider what the EDPB is saying.
All right, thank you. We have a question. Michael, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You were talking about privacy information management systems. And me personally, I've seen this last year, initially driven by ISO 27701. So there's the possibility to build such a information management system. However, talking to my leadership, they ask me, of course, from an economical perspective, because this is again an investment, and depending on the size and the nature of your enterprise, it may be a significant investment. So my question is, do you have any arguments ready, collected somewhere to figure out the reinvestment and to figure out the return of invest for such a PIM already that we may use to have a better position talking to our leaderships?
Well, of course, yes. First of all, my sales colleagues would be happy to answer that question and have a tailored answer for you. But more in general, I would say that having a good privacy management system, information management system in place will actually give you a better control over the data that is being processed in the organization. That will reduce risk, especially the compliance risk. It's also reputational risk. For example, in case of a data breach, but also in case of a DPA investigation where you appear not to have a good control over your data. On the other side, it will also actually help you to do more with the data that is already available within the organization, because if you understand properly what data you have, for which purposes it was collected, it can also become easier to find compatible uses for that data, or to indeed be able to combine data sets, of course, in a legal manner, but to combine those data sets and see what other value you can derive from the data within the boundaries imposed by GDPR. And from the compliance perspective, once you have all that information properly documented, it will also make it easier to do these data protection impact assessments, to do the data transfer risk assessments, and also do that for multiple of your processing operations, maybe at the same time, depending on the purposes and the data sets used. So you can be much more efficient and effective, and also future-proof your privacy program. And especially with legislation continuously changing, you don't want to spend every year a number of weeks on implementing yet another privacy law in yet another jurisdiction where you operate.
Thank you very much.
All right, Frank, please.
Yeah, thanks first of all to the presenters and all the interesting questions and ideas that came up. What I would like to follow up is two things that both Rebekka and Paul mentioned in regards of the approaches, and slightly also coming back to the benefits a code of conduct might have. Because what Rebekka mentioned, that within their approach, they are likely having similar ideas and similar concepts as we might be discussing within the European Cloud Code of Conduct module. And also Paul mentioned that there might be the need of having those privacy management systems within companies that are already existent. And by that, there are different, let's say, dimensions and different paths how to have similar matters in place and similar measures in place from companies. And the only thing that one might argue is where's the difference maybe between a common management system and maybe just the recommendations that Bitkom is currently developing is the legal effect. Codes of conduct and certifications are considered to be a safeguard in that regard with legal effects, and by that could limit the risks. And what I would be interested in is how both the presenters envisage the overarching benefits that it might end up in 3 different approaches, so to say, that are compatible to each other. And by that, depending on the individual mechanisms and management systems, then companies might integrate to also have a very easy access to such additional safeguards as a code of conduct, and by that easily have also the legal benefits in place.
I'm not sure whether easy will ever be applicable to these discussions, but yes, in theory, I fully agree with you that that is how it should be, and that the different modules within the code of conduct should be able to be combined and build upon each other's work.
Yeah, I agree, and I also think we will always see different solutions to an issue as large as the Schrems II situation. Because, Frank, you're absolutely right. The legal consequence of being part, being member, signatory, whatever you'd like to call it, to a CoC is very broad. It's one of the best legal consequences that you can have, basically, in the Schrems II environment. But the way till you get there is long, as we all well know. And being a member of a CoC might not work for every company there is in the EU. So we'll always need different solutions. I think the approach you can take with the CoC is preferable to many others. Our view is always what we try to do is build a system or build a concept that will work for basically every company there is in the Schrems II situation, because we have over 2,000 members, and I guess everyone is currently contemplating how to solve the issue. And in the perfect world, we would all our members would sign up to a CoC and everything would be fine in a few weeks. But as we all know, we don't live in that world. And that's why I think we'll always need different solutions. And the system Paul has been describing is another part of that. And I think what makes industry and all of our work so compelling is that we're working on a solution with different perspectives, but they are all helping and they are all developing the system further. They are all leading to more legal clarity, which is of the utmost important at the moment. And it also, and I think that is fundamental in the current debate, because it's so politically like overburdened with everything between the EU and the US especially, is that we're focusing on facts and we're focusing on what the GDPR is telling us, what all of the other parts of the legal framework, what all of the regulation is telling us, and then every company can decide for itself what best way is there to move forward.
What I actually really like about the GDPR is that it doesn't give a one-size-fits-all approach. Because it is norms-based legislation, it can be adapted to serve multiple purposes, to serve multiple types of organizations, multiple types of business processes. And obviously, I mean, even though it would be great if as many companies as possible sign on to the Cloud Code of Conduct, not every organization is a cloud service provider that would be able to meet the criteria of the Code of Conduct and might be able to join. So whatever we can come up with, also in the third country module, will only be part of a solution, and there will be other solutions for international transfers as well. What I like about the possibility of having the Code of Conduct in place for international transfers is that it will give a larger degree of legal certainty, like you would get with an adequacy decision, and probably a little higher than with the standard contractual clauses, because the supplementary measures that we are envisaging would to a large extent be baked into the Code of Conduct or at least that is my hope and my goal for this third country module. If we indeed are able to do that, that also means that the additional safeguards that we can come up with have received the blessing of the supervisory authorities. And that still means that you need to do your case-by-case assessments. So much has been made clear by the European courts, but it will go a long way in terms of legal certainty.
All right. Well, actually, I think that was a great that's a great way to conclude the discussions. If somebody, our time is almost up. If somebody has a final question, since I don't see it here, yes. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. This was really constructive discussion. And again, thank you very much. And I hope I see you guys very soon.